words from the Bible. Just want to make a few comments about the scriptures. Jesus said, "Peace I give you, not as the world gives peace, but my peace." And I suppose in the context that he was in, he was talking to people that were under occupation. And those occupiers, for example, the Romans, they offered the emperors, they offered peace to the people. Literally, they said, "We are here to give you peace." But it was always at a cost, a great cost of being under occupation, being under oppression, taxed heavily. Yes, there was a level of peace, but not the kind of peace that Jesus was talking about. And there are so many wonderful images of peace in the Old Testament as well. And one of my favorite ones is right after the story of Noah, the ark and flood. And after all of that destruction, then what did God do? And what did God say? God said, "I place my bow in the clouds. I'm hanging up my weapon. No more." And we see the bow, and we're reminded to put our weapons away. And the earlier passage from Psalm 46, a beautiful, beautiful passage that, first of all, spends a whole bunch of verses describing God's great power and might. And then at the end it says, what does it say? "Be still. Be still and know that I am God." And the actual implication in the original language of that phrase, "be still," is stop fighting. Stop fighting. Sometimes it feels like life is a battle, and we need to hear God say, "Stop fighting." The early church was a pacifist church. It rejected violence. It was committed to nonviolence. And it grew. It grew because it had an attitude toward life that was different from that of the society that it was in. A different view of possessions, a different view of power, a different view of violence, a different view of people. The early Christians were different. And it was interesting, and it was attractive, not because of exciting worship or strategic programs and plans. In fact, it was very difficult to join the first century church. There was a long trial period, sometimes 2 years, and one needed a sponsor. And there were bouncers to make sure not just anyone came in. I don't think we have bouncers here. A quick reading of the stories in the book of Acts gives the impression of the golden days of church growth, where churches grew miraculously and life was heavenly. But the early church grew for very particular reasons. It was because it treated people in a way that was in complete contrast to the way that they had normally been treated. During that time, there was much poverty. And as you know, there were many plagues, a lot of disease, a lot of sickness. And those who became sick, whether babies or children or adults, they were often abandoned and left to die, and sometimes literally in the gutters of the streets. People were afraid to go near them because they then might get infected. But the Christians were different. The Christians, they tended to the sick. They took them in. They cared for them. And if they died, which often they did, they gave them a proper burial. And that, specifically, was why the early church grew. One of the worst things that people could imagine was to not have a proper burial. And they saw that people weren't getting it. They were being abandoned and left. And while the rest of society was afraid to touch the dead bodies of those who became sick and those who died, the church promised them a respectful burial. That was the early church, caring for each other, taking risks, behaving in contrast to the norm, acting in ways that were just, and being a peace church. And it was risky being the church. It was even dangerous to be the church. It was risky and dangerous to follow the teachings of Jesus and the example of Jesus. An important text for the early Anabaptists was the Sermon on the Mount. The instruction given by Jesus in this sermon is much more radical than we might think at a casual glance. The sermon is not about being nice and passive and cooperative. It's about confronting the powers. I'll just talk a little bit about some of the common examples. We know the story about turning the other cheek, which sometimes, if we just read it casually, seems like, well, that's kind of a passive thing to do. But there was a custom or a practice, and all of these examples that Jesus gave, they're examples in the context of a power inequality. So Jesus said, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, that's on the right cheek, then turn the other cheek as well. So what Jesus was describing was the person who was doing the striking was a person that had authority over the one being struck, whether because of wealth, whether because it was an owner to a slave, or anyone like that. And it wasn't necessarily meant as a violent act. It was more of an insult, putting someone in their place. And so it was done with the right hand, and it was done with the outside of the hand. And so when the cheek was struck, then the proper thing to do was to just sort of turn and be humble. But Jesus said, no, turn your other cheek. So then when the person turned the other cheek, the one who had just done the striking is now like this. And that changed everything, because that placed both of them on an equal plane. And now there was a dilemma. What do I do with this? It was confronting the power of inequality. The same thing with what Jesus said. If someone asks you to carry his bag for a mile, carry it for 2 miles. Here Jesus is describing the Roman soldiers had the legal permission, the legal right to ask a person to carry his pack for 1 mile. And that was all. If he forced someone to carry his pack for more than that, he was in trouble. He was in danger then of quite severe consequences. So, when Jesus says, if someone asks you to carry his pack for a mile, carry it for 2, as soon as that pack is carried beyond that first mile, it changes the relationship from one of someone in power to equals. Because now suddenly there's a dilemma for the soldier. What's he going to do? He's in trouble now. Because here he is seen having someone carry his pack for more than a mile. And he's at risk And so there's a confrontation of the powers. And then there's the story of if someone takes your coat, give him also your shirt. And this is, the context for this is in the court, and someone is sued for their coat. Now, if you give your shirt in this courthouse, you are naked. And so Jesus said, give him also your shirt. And then there you stand in the courthouse naked. And for them in that culture, in that time, the embarrassment was not for the naked person. The embarrassment then was for all the rest of the people. And in particular, those who had done the suing. And so these stories are not about being passive. These stories are about very boldly confronting the powers and changing, leveling, and equalizing the relationships. These are acts of peacemaking. That was the teaching of Jesus. That was the early church. And then, as you know, then along came Constantine. And Christianity eventually became the official religion of the state. And the church that had been persecuted was now in a position of favor. What a flip, what a complete roller coaster from being trod upon to being the elite. And since the state operated with the use of military power, now violence had to somehow be justified from a religious perspective. And so we have all these theologians and these thinkers start rationalizing and justifying, and soon emerged the just war theory. And eventually, the Crusades that went far beyond the just war theory. But as John Howard Yoder said, Constantine didn't change everything. Throughout the Middle Ages, pacifism never really died. And the survival of pacifism was in many ways thanks to various groups. And I'm using the word pacifism, that it's an inadequate word. It's more helpful to talk about peace building, nonviolent struggle. But pacifism is a word that is historic with us, and is a legitimate word. And at that time, of the early church, they probably didn't use that language, the language of pacifism. That's just how they acted. The survival of pacifism was in many ways thanks to various groups, or sects as they call them, that distanced themselves from the church because of their convictions, because of their beliefs. These groups included groups like the Waldensians, the Cathars, the Unity of Czech Brethren, the Franciscans, and later the Anabaptists. In addition to being serious followers of Jesus and committed to nonviolence, these groups also took exception to the hierarchy of the church. And in the case of the Waldensians, they wanted a civil religion based on the Gospels, and they rejected the sacramentalism, and they rejected the elaborate church ceremonies. And they called for access to the Bible for everyone, not only the priests, but everyone. And this was true for the Anabaptists as well. The Peace Church does not exist because some reformers sat down and decided it would be good to have a peace church option in the world. So let's add another choice and let's create more diversity. That's not why the Peace Church exists. It exists because of a recognition that peace is at the heart of the gospel, at the heart of Jesus' teaching, at the heart of the early church. And the Peace Church continues to be relevant because nonviolent peace building is effective, while war and violence consistently fails. Increasingly, people are discovering that nonviolence makes sense. It's not an abstract religious teaching. It's the only real solution. Gene Sharp, for example, is a prominent thinker who has written extensively on realistic alternatives to war. And he lists many, many cases around the world, at every level, and between nations, where nonviolent action has been successful. We are familiar with a few. We're familiar with Gandhi. We're familiar with Martin Luther King. But there are so many more. If only everyone would commit to nonviolence. The powers in the world want us to remain afraid and want us to believe that there are times when violence is necessary. If only we could let go of those fears. Anabaptist reformer Jacob Hutter said this. He said, "We would that all the world were as we are, and that we could bring and convert all men to the same belief. Then should all war and unrighteousness have an end." How confident would we be to say, if only people could all be like us, then there would be no war or unrighteousness. It may sound a bit arrogant to us, but what he said was true. They were committed to nonviolence. And if everyone was, there wouldn't be violence. Do we live in a way that if everyone lived that way, it would be a better world? If everyone treated people the way we do? If everyone acted in lineups and slow traffic the way we do? If everyone handled their money the way we do? If everyone regarded creation the way we do? If everyone spoke the way we do? Would it be a better world? This is what it means to be a peace church.